Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the International Bipolar Foundation, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Jeff Zacharias. Jeff is a licensed clinical social worker, certified sex addiction therapist, certified advanced alcohol and other drug abuse counselor, board registered interventionist, and registered dual disorder professional with extensive clinical experience in both the mental health and addiction fields. Currently, he is the president and clinical director of New Hope Recovery Center, located in Chicago, and he also maintains a private practice there. His interests include working within the LGBTQI community, all forms of addiction, severe and persistent mental health issues, personality disorders, and trauma and its impact on recovery. He is a member of several organizations, has published articles, he blogs for Psych Central, and is a public speaker as well. He currently serves on the board of directors for NALGAP, as well as as a board member for Bonaventure House in Chicago. Jeff notes, in the LGBT community, the link between mental illness, most notably bipolar disorder, trauma, and addiction is undeniable. With heightened visibility comes a need to strengthen the clinical skills required to work alongside the stigmatized population. Today, he will address the mental health issues specific to the LGBT community, examine how addiction progresses due to mental illness and trauma, and examine the best practices utilized to address illness, trauma, and addiction. Welcome, Jeff.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody is able to hear me. If you're not, then do let me know and I can speak louder or we can figure out. But it's a real honor to be here. I'm really excited to be able to present today on a subject that's near and dear to my heart, which is working with the LGBT community and all the facets of it, along with mental health, trauma, addiction, and whatnot. So it's a real honor for me to be here. So we have about, a little less than an hour together. So I want to go through the materials. I want to reserve some time towards the end if people have questions. If you are a little shy about asking questions or would prefer to do that another time, my contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint slides. Feel free to call me and or email me, and I'm glad to carry this conversation on outside of this webinar. So why don't we start with, I think that in the LGBT community, one of the first things I want to say is that when we think about the community, we want to think broader than just LGBT. And what gets presented very often when it comes to this topic is people tend to focus on the G, which is the gay male perspective. I want us to broaden our thought process and not forget the L, the B, the T, the Q, which would be questioning or queer, the I, which is intersex or asexual. And so we really want to think a little bit broader. So I try to weave those pieces in throughout the course of this presentation. But I encourage you to think big, because the community is big. And that means that the types of trauma, the types of addiction, the types of mood disorders are just as extensive as the community itself. So that's really sort of my first point I want to drive home is to think broadly. And so as we go through the slides here, the first slide that you should see up there is just a really, I feel like, a nice definition of what trauma is, although it's a little clinical sounding. So feel free to look over that. But if you go to the next slide, this, I think, is a really nice pictorial of what trauma looks like for all of our clients, but certainly clients in the LGBT community. But so trauma is experiencing too much, too fast, and too soon. So thinking now about what that looks like, how that might look like with a mood disorder such as bipolar disorder, how that looks like in relation to addictions, and thinking about how all that comes together. Another thing, the bottom piece there is the body remembers what the mind forgets. And so what we often see with clients that experience bipolar disorder, addiction, trauma, and the influence of all three is that we're often able to see it in the body of a client first before the client is able to recognize it in the brain, this trauma and the influence of addiction and mood disorder is happening. So we really want to be able to encourage our clients to be aware of what their body has going on. And they certainly don't forget these things either. So it's hoping that we can weave all those things in. The next slide is really what I want you to consider throughout this presentation about cultural considerations. And so we really want to think about when we have clients in our office, or we have friends or peers, or perhaps you're a client that's working with someone around these issues, you really want to think about the experience of what's it like to be in multiple minorities, have multiple levels of trauma, and what's it like to be a person of color? What's it like to be a gay man versus an MSM, which is a man who has sex with men? Not all persons who have sex, a male who has sex with men, recognize themselves as gay men. Same goes with lesbians. There are lesbians who recognize they are lesbians, but there are also females who have sex with females who may not identify that way. They may identify as straight, but they just have sex with females. We also want to consider the experience of the bisexual person, the transgender person, both male to female, female to male, the experience of queer, questioning, intersex individuals, and there are people who just don't know. They're just not sure, so they may fall into that asexual category. And again, we really want to think about the multiple layers of the client or the person or the peer or ourselves which are there, which would be trauma combined with minority status, combined with being in a sexual minority, combined with addiction and all those sorts of things. Because you want to take all that sort of cultural considerations into play. Some of the traumas that we know that are most common in the LGBT community are these four that are listed on your screen, which is homophobia. And that can be broken down into three separate parts, which is the internalized piece, that somehow I feel like at my core I am a bad individual, and bad is in quotes, because I identify as somewhere on the spectrum of LGBT. There's the interpersonal homophobia, which is the family members, peer members, sort of that broader community. And then there's the institutional homophobia, which is something you might hear from church or some of the more conservative members of the community. So those three things often work in tandem with each other and form this homophobia, which is really at its core is trauma. We also have biphobia, which is the belief that somehow a bisexual person that doesn't exist. That can include such language as you're not able to choose, it doesn't exist, you have to pick one or the other. So that's traumatic for members of the bisexual community. There is the trauma of heterosexism, which is sort of the broader context of heterosexual is right. Anything outside of that is wrong. And I use those terms not in a judgmental way, but just that's the mindset. There also is a lot of transphobia for individuals who identify as female to male, male to female, or somewhere in the spectrum. And that's the pieces that the trans community gets from the outside, that somehow they're defective, they can't choose, and whatnot. So those are all really some of the more common levels of trauma that we see. If you break it down even further, there are issues of relentless harassment, physical violence, verbal abuse, terrorizing, death threats, sexual assault, blackmail, oppression, bullying, cyberbullying, imprisonment. And if you think of some of the things that happen in foreign countries, and really destruction of personal and business property, it's tough when cyberbullying is something that can happen 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. There's really not a lot of opportunity for people to get away from that, because people do it anonymously. They can change screen names. So we have a lot of bullying around issues of somebody who identifies as having bipolar disorder. Then we have people who are bullied for being LGBT. Then we have people who are bullied for having some form of addiction issues. So there's that multiplicity of issues, again, of multiple levels of trauma, all sort of through the cyberbullying, bullying category. So you really want to think about that. Just a little bit more of a breakdown is threats that people receive, whether it's I'm going to hurt somebody in your life, I'm going to cause injury to someone committing suicide, and them being told it was because of their sexuality or perhaps of their mental health status. And there's, lots of sexual assault, sexual abuses, and then threats of harm to other things like pets and people. Those are all traumatic events. One that doesn't get talked about as much as I think it should be is the concept of domestic partner or intimate partner violence in the community. And that happens around trauma, that happens around mental health status, that happens around addictive status. And so what we know is about 1 or 3 to 4 same-sex relationships experiences DV. And DV doesn't have to only be physical, it can be verbal, it can be emotional, and it certainly can be sexual. What we know is that in relationship, persons who identify as LGBT and they're batters, they threaten to out the persons they're battering to work colleagues, family, and friends, and that can be they're going to out them about their mental health status, they're going to out them around addiction issues, they're going to out them around sexuality. So it can be multiple layers of battering that happen in the LGBT community. We know that those who identify as LGBT are less likely to report it because of fear of what the broader system might or might not do, so whether police or the court system, and that not feeling that people will have their back, so they're less likely to report it. And they're less likely to report it if they feel like there's a lack of solidarity in the community. If people in my peer group might not understand that I have bipolar disorder, or I might have a particular addiction, or whatnot. So if they feel like even in their community that there's not going to be a high level of support, people tend not to report what's going on with them. It's still legal in many states and even within cities to discriminate based on employment, housing, relationship recognition, healthcare. There's still a real lack of cultural competency in the helping professions. There are still people who believe in this concept of conversion therapy. And what's that like for a person who comes to a therapist office for help and they want to, at their core, change who they are? So that can be traumatic. And what if the helping person doesn't understand bipolar disorder or understand addiction? So that lack of cultural competency really is a sort of an institutional trauma. And there are still a number of states. We saw this week, or in the past week, Arkansas passed a law to discriminate. North Carolina, I think, is on the book. They passed it through the Senate. So it's that ability to discriminate based on perceived or actual sexual orientation. There's a little more about bullying. There's more about cyberbullying, what forms it takes and what it looks like. Again, it can happen 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 a year, and it's often anonymously. And the texts go out, the messages, the pictures go out, and then they're immediately taken down, or they remain out there. And again, it's often around this confluence of addictive issues, sexuality, and mental health status. So multiple layers of trauma. We see it a lot with our younger individuals, and this is some stats that are real recent about trauma as far as younger people go. We're showing that 33% of LGBT students report suicide in the previous year. You can see in that stat that the T is left out, the transgender community, because there's not as many stats about them. And that's why I prefaced this talk by saying, let's not forget that we want to really look at the whole spectrum of LGBT and T. 84% of LGBT students have had their, been called names or had their safety threatened as a result of sexual orientation, gender expression. I would also imagine that also has to do with mental health status. And then the numbers go even higher for the youth of color, experiencing heightened levels of abuse and harassment. And so when I work with clients, I really look at the sort of socio-ecological model of trauma, and I look at the traumas as it relates to individual factors. I look at it in identified as having some form of addiction and or mental health issue. I suspect the number would be much higher if everybody had the space to be able to own their sexuality, their mental health status, and those type of things, because I think it's much higher. Gay men, bisexual men, looks like the addictive rates are 2 to 3 times that of the general population, and we know that our LGBT clients are using substances much earlier in life as opposed to the general population. And I think that's for a variety of reasons: neglect, attachment, wanting to check out how they feel, how they identify, mental health issues that are beginning to present themselves. The substances that we know are most common in the community are the ones that are listed on your screen. So they kind of cover the gamut, but there are certain ones that are listed here that we know present themselves in different populations. So what I mean by that is when we're talking about amphetamines down at the bottom, we know with our gay or bisexual men that the rates of amphetamine use, and more specifically crystal meth use, are higher than perhaps a female or lesbian population. And that often goes in tandem with the stimulant use, with the mental health issues, with the issues of being identified as gay or bisexual, and the sexual component, and how those present themselves. And what often gets really interesting for me is the confluence of that when a person comes in to get help. Some of that, what they might see as a physical representation from amphetamines, might actually be a bipolar disorder that is undiagnosed or not fully understood or not correctly medicated. And it can work both ways. Sometimes when people present for treatment, it's really bipolar disorder. It's not an amphetamine abuse, although it might appear that. And then the flip might be true. It's amphetamine abuse, which looks like bipolar disorder. So we have to really sift through to figure out what's going on with the individual, whether it's one or both or a combination. Same kind of goes with cocaine as well. We see marijuana and opiate usage more and more with our younger populations. And some of that, again, some of the behaviors that come along with using those substances might appear like symptoms of bipolar disorder. And so we have to figure out if it's those symptoms. Is it an addiction piece? Is it trauma manifesting itself? Or is it a combination thereof? And it's usually, and I've been doing this for about 15 years now, it's usually some combination thereof. Younger people, particularly in the LGBT community, using some of the club drugs, ketamine, GHB, ecstasy. And again, some of the using can also mirror some of the mental health stuff. And presentation, we have to figure out what that looks like. There are a lot of stats in the community about what it looks like to be a Caucasian gay male, and that there is less known about the lesbian community, even less known about the bisexual male and bisexual female community, and there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the trans community. So if you're interested in doing work in this area, my call to action to all of you is to think about, are those areas that you could work in to better understand how all of this comes together, the mental health piece, the addictive piece, the trauma piece, and the confluence of that, because there's so much work to be done with the lesbian, bisexual, and trans community. It's not to say there's not work to be done with the gay community, but there's a real need. And in trying to find actual stats for the L, the B, and the T, they just are really hard to find. We do know that with lesbians, the substances listed there at the bottom are the ones that there's a more common thread through, which is alcohol, marijuana, opiates, and depressants. So a lot of the downer type things. And so, again, in thinking about, for the lesbian community, if they're using downers, you really want to think about, is that the depressant part of it? Is the depressant part of the bipolar disorder? Is it really trauma manifesting itself? What is that? For gay and bisexual men, there's a lot known, and the slide on your screen shows the drugs that are most common in the gay male community as well as bisexual community. And again, I want you to think about, when we went back to our first slide, we also have to think about what's the experience of older clients or older persons versus younger clients or younger persons. Because the traumas and the mental health issues might be much different than someone who is in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, as opposed to those individuals who are in their teens, 20s, and 30s. Just life is much different. So again, we have to not take things as just LGBT, but think about the multiplicity of demographics within that community. Here's the, this stat was released not too terribly long ago from the National Center on Transgender Equality, and this was really, in terms of addiction, this was the lone stat in that whole study. So that's why I say there's so much more work to be done. They just said that over a quarter of the respondents misused drugs or alcohol. Well, again, my thought with that is that those are people who were out about responding about being identified as trans or having some issue with drugs or perhaps mental health. But the other 3/4, let's say, of people that didn't respond, the rates are going to be very high, I feel, and it's just an untapped into demographic. You really want to think, too, in terms of addiction in the community about not just addiction as it relates to substances, but addiction as it relates to processes. So what we often know is that if there's a person in our life who says, oh, I'm addicted to cocaine, that it's not enough just to work at the cocaine piece. There are really very often some processes and mental health issues that are there in conjunction with that. So think in terms, this is how I'd like you to visualize it in your head, is in terms of a quadrant. So a line going horizontally, a line going vertically, and there are 4 quadrants there. In one quadrant, we really want to think about the issue of the substance. In another quadrant, we want to think about the issue of the behavior, so the process addiction. In another instance, we want to think about the mental health diagnosis, whether depression, bipolar, depression, bipolar, any of those things. And in another one, we want to think about issues of trauma. And then we really want to look in the middle where all of that comes together. And that's the addiction interaction piece where I really want to work to get to. Because the other piece I want to encourage you to think about is when somebody says to you, I identify as a gay male using meth. Think in terms also of an iceberg. When you see an iceberg, what we see is the very tip of that iceberg. Well, what's underneath of the surface is a much larger mass that's holding up this small tip that we can see. So the small tip is what the person wants you to know. What's underneath of that surface is really where the work needs to be done, and that's where very often the mental health diagnosis is, the shame about being diagnosed as perhaps bipolar lives, the shame of trauma, and the confluence of all that. So again, it's what gets presented as the tip of the iceberg. We want to think about what's underneath of the iceberg when working with members of the community, or you have somebody in your life that has this variety of issues. And think in terms of that quadrant for me: substances, processes, mental health, trauma. And here's just, again, a little bit of a listing of some of the more common process addictions. Food and eating disorders, that goes for both male and female. Sex, and that can run the gamut from porn to escorts to sexual anorexia to sexual compulsivity to sexual addiction. And again, we know that some of those traits might look very similar to bipolar disorder characteristics presenting itself. So we have to work to really figure out the tip of the iceberg, but what's underneath of that iceberg. Gambling, issues with money, which would be perhaps overspending, underspending, under-earning, workaholism, how all that's tied together. Internet, which can be anything from gaming to internet porn, over-exercising, under-exercising, video games, particularly for our younger people, television work, and some of the more traumatic relationships. So that's another piece of our quadrant. Remember, substances, I'm going to hammer this home, but substances, processes, mental health, mental health and how it all comes together. We know that trauma and addiction go hand in hand. I don't think I've ever worked with a client who identified as having an addictive issue that didn't have some trauma rooted from early in childhood that was based in neglect or attachment. That often starts with the parents having this is not a blanket statement, but sometimes parents having a perceived notion that the client is LGBT, or a perceived notion that the client or the person has some mental health issues. And so there very often stems with these behaviors from an attachment or neglect standpoint. Certainly not always the case, but we know it often starts there. And then that starts the traumatic thinking, and then addiction often or the beginning of addiction often unlocks that trauma or helps people deal with the trauma. And now it all starts swirling together. And the person self-medicates, they numb, they dissociate with the use of drugs and behaviors. And often that stuff presents itself as what looks like it could be bipolar disorder, maybe is, maybe isn't, but very often it's the real confluence of all that coming together. Here's what addiction seeks to do for people. It really becomes a pleasure-seeking versus survival strategy. It self-soothes, it regulates, it numbs. Very often people who we know are diagnosed as bipolar are actually self-medicating with substances, whether coke or alcohol or marijuana or opiates. And so it's really the undiagnosed bipolar who's often doing these addictive substances. If we get them to the right person, the right helper, they can get correctly medicated. They often let go of the substances. They learn to deal with the traumas, and then there's a lot of recovery that can happen there. Here's some more stats about what addiction does for a person, and it's all temporarily serves a purpose. We know that 50% of individuals are going to be exposed to at least one traumatic event in their lives, and that can be anything from a singular event, what we might call a big T trauma, which is the death of a family member, the death of a pet, the loss of a grandparent, to what I think most people experience in their life, which are what we would call little T traumas. Big T and little T are one's not more impactful than the other, but the little T traumas are those daily, sort of insidious, under the surface traumas that happen. Bullying, rejection because of sexual orientation, rejection of a person due to their mental health status, rejection of a person because they're using substances. So it's just, that little T is that daily, ongoing, insidious trauma, which is often more difficult to deal with than a sort of singular big T events. We found out that about 10 million adults in the U.S. experience alcohol and drug abuse and or mental health disorders. Those are of the 10 million people who felt out to talk about them. There are a lot of people who don't talk about them for fear of the shame, the rejection, the abandonment, the neglect that then fuels that trauma of the earlier trauma of attachment disorders. We know women are 2 times as likely to develop PTSD than men. We know that 55 to 99%, you see that 99% is almost at every single woman who uses substances reports being victimized in their lifetime. And again, that's around issues of trauma, sexuality, mental health, and whatnot. And it presents itself in a variety of ways: anxiety, panic disorder, major depression, bipolar disorder, eating disorders. So it runs the gamut. And there's a real clear correlation between substance abuse and persons with PTSD and PTSD around those with substance abuse. And that becomes sort of the chicken or the egg, what comes first, if you will. We know that research is showing that 6 to 18 months after a traumatic event, persons may begin to use drugs and alcohol to cope. That's that big T and that little T trauma. So Again, the traumatic event could be rejection over mental health status being revealed, could be rejection over a sexuality being revealed, it could be a number of those things. We know that non-drinkers or users begin to drink or use. Those who are currently drinking and using drink more, or people who are in recovery may return to full addiction. So we have to be really careful in working with our clients who identify with mental health, substance abuse, and trauma, that when something does happen that picks up that initial trauma, that they don't return to those full addictive mental health behaviors. We got to really keep an eye on it with our clients. These are just a variety of the types of trauma we know to be most common in the LGBT community, although these really are common in most any community. But we know trauma is acute, it's chronic, it can be physical, it can be emotional or behavioral, it can be sexual. We know that it's often influenced by the endurance of it, so whether it's a one-time sort of compact event or whether it's something that happens over the course of a lifetime. And so when we think about that one, I'm thinking about, what's the trauma or the endurance around somebody identifying as gay? Because we know if they're LGBT and they identify as that, they are that for the duration of their life. We also know if someone has a mental health diagnosis, that they have that diagnosis going forward most often. So that's that endurance piece that we're talking about. Traumas can be natural, they can be inflicted by people, accidents, technological, they can be intentional. We certainly know that there's psychological, and there's a more severe aspect to it if they're human-caused, if they're repeated, sort of unpredictable, multifaceted, sadistic, if they're undergone in childhood. That brings up that attachment, neglect area, and whether they're perpetrated by a caregiver. Again, that brings up that early attachment, neglect piece. There's a few examples of the big T component, and it lists a little bit of examples. So if you hear that that term being used, that's what it looks like. Again, for me, trauma is trauma is trauma, whether it's big T or little t. It's all impactful on our LGBT individuals who have mental health and substance abuse. Here's some examples of what the little t traumas look like. Again, one not necessarily any more impactful than the other, they just take on different forms. Now, here's where I see some of the confluence of all this stuff come together, whether it's trauma, whether it's mental health, whether it's sexuality, both perceived and known, and how they present themselves in trauma. And what we've come to find out is that there are about maybe 9 or 10 ways that trauma gets displayed in a person. And very often, the way that trauma manifests itself mirrors the substances they use and or their mental health diagnosis and the characteristics of it. So there is a type of trauma called the post-traumatic stress reaction. It's a type of PTSD. The LGBT community often experiences it. And it comes from having to lead a double life very often. So that's that double life of I can't tell people about my sexuality. I can't tell people about my mental health status. I can't tell people at my core who I am. So they become very hyper vigilant. And we know that within this type of trauma, there's a high rate of opiates, benzos, and alcohol use, which allows the person really to dissociate from having to live that double life. We know that there's another type of trauma that gets displayed in the sort of intersection of all these things, which is the trauma repetition, which is the person who seeks out to almost recreate the original trauma. And we see that a lot with people who self-harm, who cut, pull their hair, burn, some of the more self-destructive behaviors. But it's the person who had a trauma and almost became, I don't want to say almost used to it, but they've become somewhat comfortable in that, and they recreate those dynamics because that feels almost natural to them. So it could be the trauma, again, of coming out around sexuality. It could be the trauma of coming out as having a mental health disorder, any number of things. And then in comes these self-harming pieces, and then we have to flesh out what looks like mental health, what looks like bipolar disorder characteristic, what looks like a characteristic related to a substance, and how they all intersect. We know that there is a type of trauma called trauma bonding, and it is the person who had a trauma early in life and then seeks to bond with the type of person who did those original behaviors that felt traumatic to them. And whether they do it consciously or subconsciously, but we see this in a lot of like domestic violence or intimate partner violence. People who had something done to them early in life often get involved with partners that recreate that trauma. And so we just have to be aware of that and how it presents itself as trauma or characteristics of bipolar or characteristics related to using a particular substance. We know that there is a type of trauma that presents itself as shame. This often comes from early childhood abuse, traumatic family dynamics, people who have experienced really chaotic family lives, and that can often happen. We know there's a biogenetic, sociological piece to addiction. We know that's there for mental health. So it can be that ongoing sense of shame and self-perception that gets planted early in childhood. We know there are people who have trauma in their lives and they just seek to block it out so they don't have to feel it. And they do that through the use of alcohol and drugs or behaviors. And so I really want to encourage you to think about, for a person who presents themselves as being LGBT and has mental health issues, it has substance abuse issues, it has trauma, really sort of examining, are their behaviors related to the mental health diagnosis? Are they related to the substance? Are they trying to block out that they have either one of them, or kind of what's happening there? We know that there's a person who gets aroused by their traumas, particularly around the process addictions. That often, again, comes from a chaotic childhood. The mental health or addictive behaviors were there with their parents or the primary caregivers. Later in life, the person almost becomes aroused by that. And some of the behaviors that come about from that can look like characteristics of bipolar. It can look like characteristics of a lot of things, or it can look like characteristic of substances. So we, again, have to really flesh that out. There are the persons who dissociate. So the trauma that they had earlier in life, it's too much to even address, so they split off parts of themselves and very often compartmentalize themselves. So it can be the person who compartmentalizes the piece that has the mental health disorder. I am bipolar. I'm going to compartmentalize that. Then there might be a compartment of I'm a LGBT individual. Might be a compartment of I use alcohol. But the dissociative piece is I can't almost fuse those pieces of myself together, so I have to dissociate and manage these very compartmentalized sections of myself, because if they came together and someone were to know the real me, that would be, would be almost too much to handle. There's the person who is the traumatic self-deprivation, not able to give themselves any pleasure, able to enjoy themselves. We see this very often with process addictions. We see it very often with persons who have mental health issues, and because they have such shame attached to that mental health issue, they can't allow themselves to enjoy life or get proper help because they just don't feel like they're deserving of it, so they deprive themselves of stuff, and it's cemented in that trauma earlier in life. This is also not too terribly far off of the traumatic dissociative person who is organizes around their traumas. They take those pieces of themselves and they keep them very split off from each other. and they keep almost these things on hold because to merge them together, it's just, it's just too much for the person to deal with. So, when I'm working with somebody, I really want to help diffuse you have mental health issues. Yes, you're diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Let's get you to the proper therapist, the proper psychiatrist to get you the proper medication. Let's fuse together the part that you are using substances addictively or behaviors addictively. Let's get you the right therapist. Let's get you the right support group. And yes, you are the person who's experienced trauma in your life. Let's get you the right therapist. Let's get you the right support group. Let's put all that together and help you to fuse these pieces of yourself and almost, to heal yourself from all of it. These two also can look like, particularly this traumatic orbitohyperactivity, which is a big fancy word, but it just looks like the person who's always on, who's always jazzed. And again, that can look like bipolar. It can be related to using substances. It can be related to maybe just the person has a lot of energy. Maybe it can be the person who is an undiagnosed ADD or ADHD. And so that's how they organize their trauma around these things. And we have to really do some detective work to figure out what's happening there, what is what, and get them the proper help. And the same as the flip side of that is the person who is depressed and is organized around feelings of depression using substances that help them to dissociate or to depress themselves. And that also, again, can mirror some of the characteristics of bipolar disorder, or it can be related to substance, it can be related to trauma. So the last part of this, and I recognize that we're winding down in time, and I want to be able to answer any questions people have. This is a lot of material to cover in the span of about 45 or 50 minutes, but there are a lot of methods of therapy to work with somebody who has all these multiple issues. So I think in terms with the persons I'm working with in terms of a triangle. At the top of the triangle is the mental health issues, and what do I need to do with that person to get their mental health needs addressed correctly? Find them a good psychiatrist who understands mental health and addiction and the influence of those two things. Get them a good therapist, a good psychotherapist who understands mental health issues and addiction, and get them a good support group, whether it's a bipolar support group, a depression bipolar support group, an emotions anonymous support group, whatever it might be. The bottom of the triangle, one side of it, is the addiction piece, and I need to help them potentially get a psychiatrist who understands that, a therapist who understands that, and how they all they bounce off of each other. And then the other side is I want to help persons get good therapists, psychiatrists, support systems that understands what it means to identify as LGBTQIA and how all of those things come together. And it's so important to be able to look at that and how they all intersect, not take them as separate pieces of each other, but what's the intersection of all of that, because they all really do play off of each other. And so, what we know, some of the methods of dealing with all of these issues are some clients really respond to EMDR if they're in a space to do it. But they have to be really ready to deal with things that are going to come up. So that might be hard to do for a client who is newly in the recovery process, but it does for a lot of people who have trauma. They report some wonderful benefits. CBT is the gold standard, if you will. It's been around for a long time. It works well for mental health issues and for addiction issues. You look at thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and how they all play off of each other. One that I happen to really like is DBT, which is an offshoot of some of the CBT. But I think this is so wonderful for the person that has, the mental health, the addiction, the trauma, and an LGBT client. Is it teaches these four sort of principles, these modules, and they do them over and over again until they feel like they have them down. But that combined with a good therapist, a good psychotherapist, a good psychiatrist, really has marvelous results for the community. That's what DBT looks like. Pharmacological is another method that you want to use, not as the only answer in my book, but that is a nice adjunct to getting the client properly medicated. But understanding the influence of medication and substances and getting therapists, psychiatrists, and support team that understands which medications to use and which not to use. And so here's just a couple more synopsises of what some of the challenges are, what we can learn from the individuals in our life, whether you work with clients or you just have family members or peers in your life that have these sort of issues happening. How to help them move from chaos into connection, because that's really what it's all about. Learning how to accept all these pieces of themselves rather than avoid them. Get them set up with a proper support system and a proper support team so they can thrive and flourish. And again, here's the ending. Here's a little bit of information about myself. I am glad to send you my contact information. If you would like to email me, the email is Jeffrey, Jeffrey, .Zacharias, Zacharias, @gmail.com. I will always respond within 24 hours. I'm quite passionate about working with this community. I love working with the clients with mental health issues, with addiction issues, and with trauma in the gay community. It's what I've dedicated my whole life to working around. If you have questions, if you need any questions answered, if you want to hook people up with you, if you want, if you just need anything, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm glad to help in any way, shape, or form. And with that, I'm going to be quiet. And if anybody has questions, please let me know, and I'm glad to answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation, Jeff. We do have several questions, so I'll get started. The first question is, let's see, my question relates to the high rate of autism spectrum diagnosis that I see. I have been documented in the transgender and have been documented in the transgender community. Could this possibly be a trauma response? Mimicking autism or contributing toward autism? What is the best way to approach this when helping this population?
Wow, that's a great question, and one that I probably would have to do more research around. But you know what my sense is anyway is that there could be some real interplay off of each other. That some of the trauma could be presenting itself as autistic characteristics or somewhere on that spectrum. Or there could be some trauma related to beginning to identify or being identified as having autistic characteristics or somewhere on the spectrum. My sense is it's probably lies somewhere in the middle of both of those areas. And it really is, my best suggestion is to find a good therapist, psychotherapist that you can trust, who specializes in issues of autism and who really understands what it means to work with members of the trans community. Because there are people who say, I've worked with trans people, or there are people who say, I'm trained in working with trans people and who have really done some of the background work and the education. And so you really listen for that language. Listen for somebody who says, I've worked with trans people versus I work with them, and that's where I dedicate my work. So anyway, long story short is I think it's probably a confluence of both. Find a good therapist who understands all of it. And if you're not able to find that, email me and I will help you find that therapist. They're out there. I'll help you find them.
Sorry for that delay. Had trouble unmuting you. So, okay, next question. What is the most abused drug, in your opinion, and also what is the effectiveness of 12-step groups?
Well, I guess if you had to pick one that is the most abused, if I looked at it across demographics, age groups, gender presentation, I would imagine it's alcohol. Although surprisingly, the stats for tobacco usage are very high in the gay community and can almost rival the stats for alcohol abuse. Now, the concept of 12-step is great, and what I would say is, it's, for me as a therapist, when I'm working with somebody, it's less important how we get from A to Z, if Z is wellness. It's less important that they go from A to Z, it's less important that they get there than how they get there. So I think for a lot of people, 12-step is great, but there are people it doesn't work for, particularly if you have spiritual abuse or religious abuse or spiritual or religious trauma in your past. It may not work for you based on the language. So there are avenues like Smart Recovery, which is a wonderful adjunct to 12-step. It doesn't have that spiritual or religious language, but the bigger concept of is that it helps to find a community of people with like-minded issues. If you like the 12-step sort of structure, but didn't like the language of it, there are even atheist and agnostic groups out there. Here in Chicago, they're called Quad A, so it's Atheists and Agnostics of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'd encourage you to see if there are any of those type of groups in your area, or maybe even some online meetings of a Quad A group. So it really depends on what you find works for you. It may be multiple things work for you, but I don't know that one answer is the only way to get to wellness. And so I encourage people to explore multiple avenues.
Great, thank you for that answer. The next question. Can sexuality be a response to trauma? I identify as a lesbian and have been in a relationship with a woman for 10 years. I have had repeated trauma from relationships with males. What are your thoughts?
That is another great question. The answer is I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks that sexuality is a very intrinsic thing, and of course, my perception as a therapist and as an openly gay male is that, not to use cliched language, is that I was born this way. This is who I am at my core. But are there other ways to that? Perhaps. And maybe some of the traumas that have been done by male figures in a female's life, how they express themselves in terms of orientation or relationship, could be a trauma reaction. Or it could be, maybe the flip side is that there was, the sense of being born lesbian, but the thought of it, or the trauma of identifying that within the person's self, is how they began to date or be in relationship with men, and it just took some of those traumas to maybe identify what was there all along. Or it could be a combination of all of that. Again, it's really get a good therapist who understands sexuality and all the various aspects of it. So gender expression, sexual orientation, sexual expression, and looking at how all those things are sort of influenced by each other. And then, getting in a good support system and a good therapist to really look at what's there. Is it a trauma reaction? Is that something that can be healed if I deal with the trauma? Is this really who I am? And I don't know. I tend to think it could really be many things. I think each person is so different. So it could be a variety of things. I don't know that there's one good answer, so I apologize for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeff, are you with us? You seem to have lost your
I
signal.
am.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, in and out though.
Yes, okay. I can hear you now. Go ahead. Did you hear that question?
I did not. I couldn't hear anything. It was silent.
Okay. Does the LGBT community accept non-LGBT therapists?
Oh, I most certainly do. I mean, I can tell you in my practice and in my agency I own, we have both LGBT therapists and both what we call allies. And I have a number of clients who almost at times prefer working with a non-member of the community for a variety of reasons. But there are, I would hope that the majority, if not all, of therapists understand the LGBT community, want to work with the LGBT community, and recognize the intrinsic value in the community. But again, you really want to look for therapists who say, not only I have worked with LGBT clients, but really I have studied, I have done education around, I've done groups around, I've done trainings around. You really want those therapists who are really most passionate about working with the community. And they are out there, whether they identify as LGBT or an ally. They're there. You just have to, sometimes you just have to really seek it out and ask a lot of good questions.
Great, thank you. The next question, does trauma arousal work hand in hand with BDSM?
Wow, that's a great question. It can. It most certainly can. And we don't want to, I work real hard not to pathologize or sexually pathologize individuals who practice BDSM. We don't want to do that because there are people that's what's in their arousal template. But it could be that that's trauma recreation and it's trauma arousal, and it's almost working or seeking to figure it out in a safe, contained environment to try to make sense of it all and almost experience the original trauma in a different way. There are times that I think people have described it as almost healing because they get to reclaim the dynamics, reclaim the power within that original trauma through their experience of BDSM. That's a really complex issue, and it's a great question. And if you're thinking about working with somebody or seeking out somebody who understands that, you really want to ask questions of the therapist that they understand sex and sexuality and all its varied expressions and not pathologize sex or sexuality that's outside of this very binary sort of response. So, yeah, it's a great question. I'd love to do more research on that one.
Excellent, thank you. It looks like we've wrapped up all the questions for now. However, if you could possibly repeat your email address.
I can.
Okay.
So it's it's Jeffrey, Jeffrey .Zacharias, Zacharias, so Jeffrey.Zacharias @gmail.com. And again, I try to respond to all emails by the end of the day, if not within 24 hours, certainly. So feel free to email me at any time at Jeffrey.Zacharias @gmail.com.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeffrey, for being with us today. Very much appreciated. And again, this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the website at ibpf.org. And certainly if you have any questions and you happen to have forgotten or did not write down Jeff's email address, you can send your questions to me at dbrown@ibpf.org, and I'd be happy to forward them to Jeffrey. So once again, thank you so much for your insight, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you.